Hi, I'm Miss Hottie from Olympian High School. We'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley, chapter 40, page 1161, to take a look at the trends in migration throughout history. So migration is the movement of people from one place to another. We're going to be looking at two major kinds of migrations. Internal migration, largely made up of people moving from the countryside or rural areas to the urban areas or city areas. That's internal migration within a country. And then you have external migration between countries. And when we look at these two kinds of migrations, we want to think about what are the causes that can be called the push and pull factors, which you probably learned about if you took AP Human Geography. And the other thing we want to think about are what are the effects, and what is the context under which this is all taking place. So there's a growing difference or disparity between rich countries and poor countries, and that's one of the reasons. There's also issues like war, increased violence. Those things can be part of those factors that contribute to people wanting to leave their country of origin. Okay, so first, this just understanding what is migration, and then understanding that this has changes to the places that receive migrants. It can lead to more cultural diversity, which can be a positive or a negative, depending on your point of view. If you're more xenophobic or afraid of the other, or if you're trying to maintain a specific kind of culture, you may feel threatened by a different language or different religion being practiced in your country. Okay, so we talked about what internal migration is and what external migration is, and some of the things that might lead to people leaving. So lack of resources, population pressure, persecution, discrimination might cause people to be pushed out, to move. Other causes are pull factors that draw you in, like possibly improved employment or better health care, more arable land. And of course, because there's a difference between countries, that causes people to want to seek migration to another place. And it doesn't necessarily even mean between countries. It can be between the urban areas, the more city-like areas, and the rural areas. There could be a difference causing people to move from the rural areas to urban areas. Okay, so let's study internal migration, specifically movement from rural areas to urban areas. And that's been taking place for a long time. Now we know that most parts of the world that we've looked at that are in the temperate climates, you have large urban populations. In Germany, it exceeds 85%. Latin America, that's 50 to 65%. In Africa, it's just starting to become urbanized. So in these areas, what you'll see developing are what are called slums, but there are many names for the slums. It could be, they call it a barrio or via miseria, barriadas. So people moving to these big cities hoping for better access to healthcare, better employment opportunities. These benefits end up living on the fringes of society, for example, places like Calcutta or Cairo or Mexico City, and they don't always have, access to resources that they thought they would have. Diseases run rampant, it's dirty, and there's often a lot of malnutrition. So there is a really cool, interesting fictional movie that you could potentially watch for extra credit called Slumdog Millionaire, and that shows scenes from the slums, what it's like there. So that's something that if you're interested in learning more, you could look into. Okay, so obviously, if you've ever been to Mexico City or to a large city, you see people living in conditions that are, not sanitary, not safe, but they're trying to have access to improved education or improved healthcare. This goes into a history of what migration was like. This is important because the AP exam often asks you questions about migration. Make sure you're able to speak to human migration. There was one year where it asked a migration question. People were talking about like the migration of animals or the migration of butterflies and things. Okay, so be able to recap some of this information. You know about the migration we've learned about in the past, people moving from Europe to the Americas and then to other parts of the world. You know about the Atlantic migration. You know about slave migration. You've learned about, in the Atlantic slave trade, 12 million people moving from Africa to the Americas, 4 million dying en route. Since World War II, there have been other migrations. So the Nazis expelling many people, deporting 8 million people to forced labor sites, exterminating 5.6 million, I believe, people is the most current number that I've heard. The Soviets expelling 10 million ethnic Germans. You have, during the partition of the state of India into India and Pakistan, large movements of Hindus and Muslims to get either to Pakistan for Muslims or to India for Hindus. You also have, anytime there's a war, oftentimes there are refugees that flee the conditions of the war and are stuck, unable to return home because they're afraid of what will happen to them when they get back. So sometimes they're leaving to escape war, sometimes they're leaving to take advantage of economic opportunities in in a place that has better working conditions. So they're looking for better healthcare or educational opportunities. For example, you have guest workers in many states that have come in from other countries. We have guest workers here in the United States, in Southwest Asia, which is the Middle East. You also have large populations of guest workers. These migrant communities are going to introduce their cultures to the communities that they become integrated in. So that might include ethnic food, art, music, and that can cause resentment and conflict from native people. They're not really indigenous because, for example, in America, the real indigenous people, many of them were killed when the colonizers originally came here. But there's resentment, there's afraid that the way of life is changing, that could change the culture. So if some people feel threatened and there's xenophobia, if there's an economic downturn, the easiest person to blame is the one with the least amount of rights, the marginalized groups, which includes these immigrants, which are often scapegoats. They're often blamed as taking jobs. But when conditions are good, when the economy is good, that's less likely to happen. But anytime there's an economic downturn, that tends to happen more. Sometimes there's increased violence and attacks against foreign groups. So you can read about in your book how there are more neo-Nazis and skinheads that have started to really resent the increase of Turkish workers. And this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. In more recent years, you guys can continue to learn about this on your own. Obviously, there have been issues with migrants even during the last presidency of Donald Trump and the current presidency of Joe Biden. We're seeing many, many people coming from Central America through Mexico, trying to gain entry into the United States. And there's been a lot of tension within the United States about what to do with these migrants and what to do with migrant children. Sometimes they've been separated from their families, and that's caused a lot of conflict between Americans about how do we resolve this issue of people trying to come into our country. And oftentimes they're escaping gang violence, really terrible conditions in their home state. So this is affecting us here in the United States. You can read more about it on your own, but it tells you here about some of the reasons that people leave their countries, and this is something we're going to have to continue to work on resolving in our country. Something I haven't talked to you about, that I will make a video about separately, is the Arab Spring and then later the Syrian civil war that caused a number of refugees to flee Syria. And, they've been displaced. These people have been displaced. They need humanitarian assistance. Oftentimes they sought refuge in European countries. And because these Syrian refugees are often Muslim, not all are, some are Christian, some are Jewish, but because they're often Muslim, which is a different religion than what you largely see in Europe, although there are Muslims in Europe, this has led to some xenophobia in Europe and even the rise of more right-wing conservative governments that tend to be pro-immigration restriction. And there was a famous incident of I believe it was a Hungarian camerawoman kicking migrants who were fleeing the police. So this is just one example of how migrants are sometimes mistreated.
Horrifying viewers around the world. In a separate incident, Hungarian news website Index reported.
So this mistreatment of people because there's a fear of immigrants or a fear that the immigrants are, sometimes immigrants are perceived as potentially being more dangerous, increasing crime. And this is debatable. Sometimes crime rates do increase, but sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's just a blaming of immigrants. Another issue you want to look at we're going to continue to see in the news is African migrants trying to leave Africa also to reach Europe for better job opportunities, and many of them sometimes die on these ships that are sinking in the Mediterranean as they try to get to Europe. And of course, being here in the United States, there's all kinds of issues with illegal immigration. I should be careful with my use of words there, because some people take issue with the word illegal and calling someone illegal. All of these. This is something that's a very sensitive topic, but this is not unique to the United States. Around the world, there's the issue of migrants, and again, it doesn't necessarily need to take place between countries. Even people from moving from the countryside to the city, these people are often discriminated against, and there's social hierarchies that are created. But it largely has to do with these push and pull factors that we need to understand better if we're going to address the issue of migration in our time period.